Hello everybody, this is Sudeep Manchanda from Quite Easily Done. This video is a part of the series Know Your Component, and the component we will be talking about today is capacitors. And what we will be covering in this video is what are capacitors, how do they work in terms of their charging and discharging, and we would also talk about polarized versus non-polarized capacitors. So let's get started. A capacitor is again another very famous electronic component that we very frequently used in our circuits. Like resistors, they can be found in almost every circuit that we work on with. A capacitor is a device which we use to store charge. When we say a capacitor is charged, it is actually it has stored charge using an external power source like a battery or something. And once it is charged, the capacitor can also be discharged to be able to release a huge amount of current in a very short duration of time. And we would understand all of that in this video. So capacitor, if you look at the diagram on the right over here, is nothing but two plates, metal plates, which are very close to each other and connected to terminals. And it has a dielectric element in between. So that is the physical structure. And how do we come to this, and why do we create capacitors in such a structure? We would understand that. So if we take an example of a very simple plate, any plate, for any metal plate for that matter, just one single plate, and we try and connect it to a source of, let's say, to a negative polarity. Ideally, when we're connecting this metal plate to the negative polarity of a battery, we would expect the electrons to move into the plate and charge this and make the plate negatively charged, which does not happen. The reason being is for every electron that is pushed by the battery into the metal plate, a negative charge would get developed in the plate. But this negative charge, this additional electron, would be repelled by the rest of the electrons in the metal plate back towards the battery. So by itself, the repulsive force, is the repulsive force by the electrons, and the other is the force by the battery. These two would get cancelled by each other, and we will not see any flow of electrons towards the metal plate by itself, because assuming that we are not using a very high level of a battery, a very powerful battery over here, we're using probably a 5 volt or a 9 volt battery. Under those cases, it is very difficult to overcome the repulsive power of the electrons that is there. So what do we do in such a case? Because our ultimate objective is to store charge somewhere. The storing of charges would be like the storage of charge in a battery, but that is through chemical reactions that we are able to discharge it. So what we do is we put in another plate, metal plate very close to the original one that we were trying to charge. So we have one metal plate, and then we have another one which is very close to each other. The neater diagram is on the right. So what happens in this case now is, when we try and connect this to a battery source, the electrons would try and move up here and up into this plate. So we would try and get an additional electron over here. We talked of the electron by itself would try to cause a repulsive force also. So the amount of charging would happen would depend on the voltage that we are applying over here, which is the V voltage. When the V voltage is higher, we would be able to achieve some very bare minimum amount of charge, which we are saying is almost negligible, kind of worthless. But because we have another plate in front of it, as soon as we are able to manage to push in just one electron into this plate over here, there would be some negative charge that would develop on this plate. Okay, and that is what has started to cause the other electrons in this plate to try and repulse this additional electron that had come in. simultaneously, because there is a plate which is very close by over here, this additional negative charge that has developed would cause a repulsion of an electron in the plate right in front of it also. So this would the plate that is there in front of it would lose an electron, causing a positive charge to develop here. Now what happens is, just by pushing in one electron into it, we were able to cause a repulsion force for electrons in the plate in front of it, giving it a positive charge. This positive charge creates an additional pull force for the electrons coming in from the negative terminal over here. So earlier, without the second plate, we had was the force coming in because of the battery, which was being opposed by the repulsive force. But now we have additional force, which is the attractive force, because of the positive charge in the opposite plate. So because we have two forces working against one now, we would be able to pump in a relatively higher amount of electrons into the plates, and so one of the plates would develop a negative charge, the other one be able to develop a positive charge. So if we now look at this, there are two factors to it which would depend the amount of charge that the capacitor, actually three factors which would depend the amount of charge that the capacitor can hold. One is of course the V, the voltage that is there in the as the battery source. Second is it would be directly proportional to A, the area. The bigger this plate is, the more charge, the more additional electrons would be able to accommodate into it, and it would be inversely proportional to the D, the distance which is there between the two plates. If it is closer, the repulsive force happening on the other plate, forcing the electrons to push out, would be higher, and we would be able to push out more electrons. And similarly, because of the positive charge, it would be, if the plates are close by, they would be able to attract higher number of electrons in the first plate. So by this having two plates very close to each other, we have been able to store some good amount of charge into it. But in order to increase the capability of the capacitor to be able to store charge, we insert another item into the picture, which is the dielectric material. The dielectric material is something which is polarized in sense. So what happens is, in the between these, it will each molecule of this material would align itself such that the positive of the material of the molecule faces the negative plate, and the negative faces the positive plate. What it basically is doing is kind of helping the attractive forces. It creates like multiple magnets when they're connected to each other and making it a powerful magnet, or multiple batteries connected in series causing a higher electric power coming in. So the dielectric material, when it is inserted into it, it is able to assist this this force in between of plate 1 being able to repel electrons out of plate 2, and plate 2 being able to attract further electrons into plate 1. So when we have the capability of a dielectric material to be able to provide this additional force is called as permittivity, which is PERMITT, and it's represented as kind of E. So there would be a permittivity that would be there for the air which is there in between when something is not filled, and relative to that permittivity is a relative permittivity ER, which is the permittivity of the dielectric material that has been filled into between the two plates of the capacitor. So once we look at the entire thing of our understanding that the capacitance is nothing but the capability of the capacitor to store charge, or how much of charge would the capacitor be able to store, is capacitance. So the capacitance, we said, would directly depend on the permittivity of the material, would be directly proportional to the area, and would be inversely proportional to the distance between the two plates. So that is how we come up to the formula. I'm not going into the details of how did this 4 pi come into the place, but basically that gives us the capacitance of the capacitor. Now we said the capacitor actually stores charges, charge into it. So the amount of charge Q that would be stored into it would be capacitance into the voltage that we would have applied, which is right here. So we know the charge that would get stored and the capacitor. So by this process by which we have been able to store charge into a capacitor is called discharging of the capacitor, and we know the amount of charge that would get stored into it. Now by this, once it is charged, it might look very similar to a battery, which it is, in the sense that once it is connected to a load, it will cause a flow of current, and ultimately the current would flow into the load, and if it is, let's say, an LED, the LED would glow. The difference, however, is a battery is able to provide lower currents for a higher amount of time, whereas a capacitor is usually used for providing higher current for a lower amount of time. The reason is every battery by itself has some amount of resistance that it provides to the flow of current. So let's say in this case, if I add a resistor over here, R, practically speaking, the current would flow from positive to negative, and the current I that we know would be I is equal to V by R. That is what we had talked about in the Ohm's law. But actually the current would be slightly less because of an additional delta resistance provided by the battery itself. That is why we had talked of when the current actually flows very high through a battery, it gets heated up. That is because of the resistance over here. There. Okay, so we would not be able to draw in enormous amounts of current from a battery source very quickly. But in case of a capacitor, when the capacitor is getting discharged, this internal resistance delta that we are talking of is almost negligible. And because of this, we would actually be able to draw in huge amount of currents from a capacitor. Okay, so let's look at how this circuit diagrams of how a capacitor gets charged. So we have is a resistance RC over here, which is connected with the capacitor, and ultimately a power source V. In this case, if you look, the current starts flowing in over here, and the capacitor gets charged. Now when we come up to a stage where all the forces that were there get balanced out each other, that is the maximum capacitance, that is when the capacitor, we say, is fully charged, and then this flow of current would become zero. And we know by the formula is that is when the amount of Q charged gets accommodated into the capacitor. So this is when we are saying is we are charging the capacitor, because the current is flowing through the capacitor and gets charged. Once it is charged, we can disconnect the load from here, as we have disconnected it, disconnect the battery source and connect it to a load, as we have done it here, right? So now the flow of current is I in the reverse direction from the capacitor to the load. So the battery source over here does not provide anything because it's disconnected, and the flow of current is happening from the capacitor to the load. This flow of current would happen till when the entire charge Q within the capacitor is not discharged. So the capacitor would slowly start getting discharged as the load keeps drawing current from the capacitor, and once it is discharged, this flow of current I would become zero. So in the above diagram, the flow of current I is equal to 0 would happen when the capacitor is fully charged, and when we are discharging it, the current flow would become 0 when the capacitor is completely discharged. And we said that the internal resistance of a capacitor is so low that this current can be very high if we want it to be. So the practical application of a capacitor therefore is we would find it a lot of time put something like this, and we would say this is our V out, for example. This could be our voltage regulator. We will talk about these components in the future videos, but let's say we have a voltage regulator which and the output of that we put a capacitor in parallel to the output voltage. This capacitor is basically being able to take up the any additional flow of current or provide an additional current in case there is a very huge variation in the external circuit over here in terms of load. So sometimes what happens is when let's say we originally had a 10 ohm load to the output, we would drastically increase it to 100 ohms. That would need an additional surge of current very quickly to the external circuit. That would be provided by the capacitor by discharging. And let's say we do it the reverse way. We had a load of 100 ohms and we reduce it to 10 ohms. We would have an additional flow of current which the external circuit does not need, so that would be used up by the capacitor to get charged. So that is one practical example where capacitors actually help us in our circuits. So it is used for the similar principle is also used for noise reductions in our circuits. So the capacitor, the last of the topics that we had to talk of was the difference between a polarized capacitor and a non-polarized capacitor. So the one on the left over here is a polarized capacitor, which you can see is kind of a cylinder which has two legs in it, the smaller one and the bigger one. The smaller one is always called the negative lead and the bigger one is called a positive lead. The symbol of it also changes. You see there is a curve which shows the negative one and negative side of the capacitor, and the one straight is the positive side of the capacitor, whereas we might have something like a ceramic capacitor also, which is two straight lines and does not have a polarity per se. Both the legs are of the same size and can be used in any of the directions. So why do we have these two different types of capacitor? A polarized capacitor, the one on the left, is able to provide a high capacitance for a given size. So for the same size of a polarized and a non-polarized capacitor, a polarized capacitor would be able to provide you guys with a higher capacitance, and similarly it also has is what is called a small leakage, a very high leakage into it. That is the disadvantage of it, that so if we charge it, it would get the leakage is basically if you have it charged and you're not kind of drawing any current out of a capacitor, it would still get somewhat leaked over the period of time. So that is why a capacitor cannot kind of replace a battery also. The leakage in case of a polarized capacitor is high. So what happens is, if I connect the polarized capacitor in the right direction, saying I connect the positive to the positive and the negative to the negative where it has to be, it would act as a capacitor. But in case I do a mistake and I connect the negative to the positive and the positive to the negative, it is actually a short circuit. This is what we should be avoiding. So that is the reason why it is used majorly into DC applications. In a DC circuit, because the polarity is always constant, so a polarized capacitor can be used over there very nicely. And a non-polarized capacitor is kind of opposite to it. It gives you a lower capacitance for a given size, has also a lower leakage into it, and finally it is majorly used into AC appliances because of the fact that it does not have a polarity, and an AC is alternating current. The direction of the current would keep changing one way and then the other way, and the capacitor would be able to hold a charge or be used as for charging purposes in either of the polarities that is there. So that is all about the capacitor that I wanted to share with you guys. Please let me know if you guys have any questions for me. Do like me, comment and subscribe to our channel for more videos that would be coming up. I would be there to answer your questions if you have any. Thank you very much.